What's going on, guys? It's Cimo, and welcome back to the top 100 Yu-Gi-Oh cards of all time. In this video, we're covering numbers 60 through 51, cards all the way back to when the game started up till 2018. Just to catch you up, we're rating these cards based off how powerful they were in their prime, as well as if they were to come back in the format today. So, before we get into it, big shoutouts to all of my patrons as well as YouTube channel members for their continued support. And if you want to help support the channel yourself, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 60, we have one of the most feared cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning. Now, BLS basically is just one of the craziest cards to have ever been printed all the way back in Invasion of Chaos. It was one of the original Chaos monsters, and even to this day in 2018, when someone drops BLS, you kind of just have that oh shit moment because you know your opponent's going for a massive push because this card is a 3,000 body that you get to summon for free, essentially. It can banish cards and it can also attack twice, meaning you're going to take a shitload of damage. Now, this card has been on the limited list for a very long time, but now it's back at 3. That just goes to show how power creep has overtaken the game. And now that it's at 3, it's even scarier because even if your opponent drops 1, you know they could still have 2 more potentially left in their hand or deck that you're still gonna have to deal with. And anytime you're going up against a deck that's meta, established, and you know they're playing BLS, it always has to be in the back of your mind, how can I stop that if they drop that on me? This card is the face of so many losses. This is usually the card that people see before they're about to get utterly wrecked, and that's why it had to make its way on this list in some form or another. Now that brings us on to number 59. For number 59, we have a card that seems rather innocuous, but is actually one of the craziest cards ever printed, Machine Duplication. Now, Machine Duplication first pretty much got its big debut in tandem with Card Trooper, the good old days of Troop Dupe Scoop. You'd summon a Card Trooper, Machine Duplicate it, summon 2 more, then you pump them all up to 1900, load up your graveyard, which is going to give you a ton of resources, and back in the day, that was just an overpowered combo, and most likely would just kill your opponent that turn. But nowadays, you see, we've got stuff like, Spiral Quick Fix, since it's also a machine that has less than 500 attack, summon out 2 more copies of Quick Fix, which all happen to generate +1s on summon, so basically turn Machine Dupin like up to a +3, +4, something like that, but basically helped Spiral almost become the tier 0 deck that it was for a few short weeks. Machine Duplication, because it really has no downside, the only real hard counter to it's something like Ash Blossom. Anytime there's a machine monster with less than 500 attack, you always have to think Machine Duplication because this card is just utterly nuts, and the fact that it has no downside basically means there's no reason not to play it if the deck can support it. So, utterly insane card. I can't believe this card has no drawbacks, and really just one of the most powerful cards ever printed. That is going to bring us on, however, though, to number 58. And for number 58, we've got one of the oldest cards ever printed in this game, Last Will. Now, Last Will, a lot of people might not even know what this card is. Basically, if a monster is sent from, it's basically just sent to the graveyard. It's been a long time. I forget if it's from field to the graveyard or even just the graveyard, but in either case, you're able to special summon any monster from your deck with 1500 or less attack. Yeah, just think about that. Any monster, 1500 or less attack. Think of how many broken, overpowered monsters have 1500 or less attack that Last Will could immediately just dump out onto the field for essentially free. Because let's be honest, nowadays in 2018 Yu-Gi-Oh!, getting a monster into the graveyard is probably the easiest thing you can possibly do. So being able to have this essentially combo enabler slash extender that can dig for anything in your deck is just absurd. This card was banned very quickly just because of how powerful it was. There have been a lot of degenerate combos with it, most notably stuff with Yatagarasu being typically followed up after a board wipe, just so you could start poking your opponent and prevent them from accruing resources. So definitely glad that this card is banned because it has one of the most notorious legacies ever in this game, especially if you played back when the game first came out. Now that's going to bring us on to number 57, and for number 57, we actually had another draw. It was actually a tie between Rescue Rabbit and Rescue Cat. Now, the reason I put both of these together is because they're technically a part of the same archetype, if you want to even call it that, but Both of these cards are insane. I mean, Rescue Cat back in the Synchro Cat days, even in tandem with Gladiator Beasts, this card just had so much power behind it. And the funny thing was, it was actually just a common, I believe, out of Flaming Eternity, and basically had it made its way into so many different decks because the ability to special summon 2 monsters, you know, actually seems pretty good. And there's no once per turn clause on Rescue Cat, so it was highly abusable. It received an errata much later on, but it's even still broken now. I mean, we've seen stuff, I think, like World Chalice or even Burning Abyss play Rescue Cat just to turbo into something like Naturia Beast and lock their opponent out of the game. And then Rescue Rabbit is a completely different beast, but also just as powerful because you're able to special summon, you know, 2 level 4s, which are vanillas, and, you know, go into stuff like Evilzor Lagia, Evilzor Dolka, you know, all the Dino Rabbit stuff. That's kind of where Rescue Rabbit first took off. But even again now, there's so many opportunities for a card like Rescue Rabbit to shine just because, again, special summoning 2 monsters to the field, especially now that we're under Master Rule 4, is just so advantageous. And yeah, these cards have kind of fallen down just because there's so many ways to prevent their effects from going off. But back in the day, it was really difficult for these cards to be stopped, especially with stuff like Priority, and, you know, Effect Veiler was like the only hand trap really available that was stopping these cards. These cards, while they may be cute and adorable, are some of the most feared cards in the game. That is going to bring us on, though, to number 56, and for number 56, we might actually have the newest card out of all the cards on this list, Boris Dragon. Yeah, Boris Dragon definitely made this list. And you guys might be thinking, oh, the card's not that broken. The card is that broken. You basically have just printed a card that is essentially a win condition that every single deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Can play. This card is basically a BLS that you play in the extra deck because the amount of damage that Boris Dragon is able to pump out, and with the ease of access that it just pretty much requires to make it, there's no reason not to play it unless you're playing something that doesn't play an extra deck or only summons like 1 monster a turn. But aside from those 2 instances, every other deck is probably going to be playing Boris Dragon from here on out because this card creates the dynamic that you have to think to yourself, can I lose to Boris Dragon? Because in any moment, this card can pump out so much damage just by itself, but you have to consider the fact that how many other monsters your opponent can put on the field. In addition to that, this card is just nuts. I mean, just the fact that it's able to pump itself up, it can negate effects, like, it's just, there's so much power behind this card that I honestly felt it definitely warranted a spot being on this list. Now, for number 55, we're going to be going back to a card that so many people were excited about when it was first printed, Pot of Duality. Pot of Duality may not seem that powerful, but the ability to essentially sift and choose from 3 cards, add the best one to your hand, and especially you have to realize when this card was printed, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was not nearly as fast as it is today. So people could afford to take a turn off and not special summon, and then go in on the next turn once they've assembled the correct number of cards. Pot of Duality exceeded over $100, even more in some instances, just because there was no card like it. You have to remember, every card in Yu-Gi-Oh! That allows you to generate some kind of advantage like that is usually banned almost immediately, and Pot of Duality has pretty much been at 3 ever since it was printed because it doesn't really generate you any advantage. You're just picking a card and replacing the pot with it. It's a pretty balanced card, but it was so overpowered at the time, it even still sees play today in stuff like Draco or basically any stun deck that's looking to just dig for specific cards. It's a very good card, and definitely just has to be on the list because this card is just so cool. It's so powerful. It's basically just been in so many different decks ever since it was printed that it would be a sin if it did not make the list somewhere. Now, number 54 is a card that came out relatively recently, within the past few years or so, but is one of the strongest trap cards to ever be printed, Dimensional Barrier. Now, I know that we're in Master Rule 4 now and we have Link, so Dimensional Barrier has already been power crept, but there are still instances where this card is nuts. I mean, you have to think, when this card first came out, there was no counter to it. If your opponent went first and had Dimensional Barrier and they just flipped it on you, you had no way to stop it. There was nothing you could do. Nowadays, we have Red Reboot, so that's, you know, thank God for that, right? But back in the day, especially when Zodiac came out, there was nothing you could do. You basically just automatically lost because your opponent opened with Dimensional Barrier, and that really was not fun. But the fact that it can stop essentially any form of special summoning of monsters from the extra deck, as well as ritual monsters, if you decided to call that, gave this card so much flexibility. I mean, Fusion, Ritual, Synchro, Xyz, so many different decks this card was most powerful against, and even to this day, we still have fusion-based decks in the format like Thunder Dragon, so you could in theory side it against that. This card is always going to be good because it locks down core summoning mechanics of the game, and just for that, just the fact that it's a normal trap, it's not continuous, your opponent can't stop it, even with red reboot being in the game, if they don't draw the red reboot, you can honestly just end their turn with the single flip of a card. Dimensional Barrier, one of the strongest trap cards ever made, and definitely worthy of a spot on this list. Now this is going to bring us to number 53, and for number 53, we've got one of the oldest and simplest cards to ever be printed, Raigeki. Raigeki is just pretty much the old school classic board wipe. You play it, you wipe your opponent's entire board. This card could be a 1-for-1, but it could also be a 1-for-5. Like, it really doesn't matter. There's no downside to this card. The only real downside is if you're ever in a format where all the monsters kind of float, kind of thinking back to like Duelist Alliance where, you know, Burning Abyss and Shadal were all in the game, it's not really going to do you a lot of good to Raigeki them because then they're just going to generate a ton of advantage and you kind of just lost a card for absolutely no reason. But for the most part, and especially since this card came out, Raigeki's always been powerful. This card was one of the first cards to ever be banned, and basically didn't come off the list until a few years ago. But even then, the game has been power crept to the point where Raigeki's actually a pretty fair card, and there's still times where your opponent will drop it on you, and it'll win them the game just because it's an incredibly powerful card that realistically has no downside. But the fact we're at a point where it's fair enough that we can play with it again, I think it's really cool to see that, and this card is just an absolute classic. Now for number 52, we have yet another Link monster, Heavy Metal Foes Electromite. Heavy Metal Foes Electromite, in my view, is one of the strongest Link monsters in the game, and is kind of what resurrected Pendulum Summoning for basically being extinct in Master Rule 4, because Heavy Metal Foes Electromite does everything you could ever want it to in a Link monster for a Pendulum-based deck. It gives you 2 zones to Pendulum Summon from with its downward pointing arrows. You have the ability to send any card to your extra deck that is a Pendulum monster, basically setting up whatever plays that you could want. You can then pop your own Pendulum Scales, which most likely is going to trigger some sort of effect to add cards to your hand, and then if Pendulum Scales leave the field, you also get to draw cards, and that effect is only once per turn, but it's during either player's turn, which means you can generate multiple cards off of a single Electromite. Electromite is the reason we saw decks like Pendulum FDK and Pendulum Magician basically going to the forefront of the metagame, and is the sole reason, again, that Pendulum's decks were able to survive in Master Rule 4. A lot of people have to give this card credit, and it is so powerful with so many good effects. Again, realistically no downside, definitely worthy of this slot. Now, wrapping up this video, speaking of Pendulum monsters, we have one of the most notorious Pendulum monsters of all time coming in at number 51, Performage Plushfire. Could you imagine if this card were still legal in tandem with something like Electromite? Talk about being abused. Performage Plushfire was one of the most abused Pendulum cards back in the day. This is one of the reasons why decks like Pepe were basically going to be the next tier 0 deck, because this card did not have a once per turn clause. You could just be special summoning as much as you want in a given turn. There was so much abuse behind Plushfire that it was just absurd, and had to be one of the cards that got banned when Pepe did inevitably get emergency banned. I mean, there were so many cards that got hit. Plushfire had to be one of them. Now, even if this card came back today, at 1, it probably wouldn't do a whole lot, but imagine if this card went back to 3, in tandem with stuff like Electromite and all of the other new toys that Pendulum have at their disposal. This card is a force to be reckoned with and is probably one of the most powerful Pendulum cards of all time, which is definitely why I had to put it on this list. So if you guys thought that list was crazy, just wait, because we are only halfway through this series. We still have 50 more cards to go, and if you guys thought the stuff we talked about before was broken, just you wait, because you haven't seen anything yet. So guys, that's gonna wrap up the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video entertaining, consider backing me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.